When you were little, did you have an imaginary friend? Someone that you just kind of made up and to help you pass the time? Well, I was raised an only child, and I had an imaginary friend. My daughter was raised an only child. She had an imaginary friend. What do you think happens when it turns out that an imaginary friend ends up being very, very real? Hi, I'm Nefer Kefri. I'm your hostess with the ghostess. I welcome you to True Tales of the Paranormal. I ask if you like what you see, that you hit the like button, you subscribe, and above all, please drop a comment. Comments help to get my videos out in front of new eyes, and y'all have been doing such a fantastic job. I thank you all so much. Subscribers has just gone whew, and I am really thrilled with that, and I'm glad that people are enjoying my channel. So without further ado, here is today's true tale of the paranormal. As I stated in my introduction, I was raised an only child. And thinking back to my earliest years, I believe that my imaginary friend came along when I was about 4 years old, because I started kindergarten when I was 5 and he was already around. And what I would see was a little boy. He looked flesh and blood to me. He looked very real. And he was dressed in a short-sleeved white button-down shirt. He had on a pair of dark brown shorts. They looked to be like tailored shorts, and he had little white socks that went just past his ankles, and little brown leather shoes, and he wore a little brown cap on his head. And he told me his name was Johnny. And Johnny and I, we would color together and play together. And you know how when you're a little girl and you're having a tea party with your stuffed animals and your dollies, well, he would be there with me, playing along with me, so he'd be in one of the chairs. And it got to be that when we would have our meals, I would tell Mom, you've got to set a place for Johnny. Johnny needs to eat too. And so Mom was like, oh, yeah, okay. You know, she'd kind of giggle and she'd go along with it, and she'd set a little plate with a little bit of food on it for Johnny. And Johnny would sit there and he would never eat. And you're a little kid. You don't think about that stuff. You don't think, that's kind of weird. Why isn't he eating? And my parents kind of played along. So I always assumed they could see him. So it never struck me that this was, really strange. Now you got to remember, I'm 4 to 5 years old at the time. Well, then I go off to kindergarten. And when I go off to school, Johnny tells me, I can't go to school with you. And I'm like, why not? And he says, because you're going to be making a lot of other friends there, but I'll be with you here at home. I'll be here when you get home. I'm like, oh, okay. I didn't think anything strange of that either. So I start kindergarten, come home, Johnny's always around, so life went on as it did before I started school. Then when I was about 6, it was another year went by, I was 6 or 6.5 years old, so I was in first grade now. And I remember vividly, it was a summer day, and my grandpa and I were out in our backyard, because remember, if you see my other videos, there's a card up here that features him and his experience. He used to live in one of the 2 apartments upstairs from us. My parents had a 4-story home, attic, first floor where we lived, second floor where there were 2 small apartments in the attic, and my grandpa lived in one of those small apartments. So we all lived in the same home together. He and I were in the backyard, and Johnny was out there with us, and I was kind of playing with him, talking to him, and Grandpa was just kind of looking at us, and then all of a sudden he says, out of the blue, he says, I can see him, I said, what? He says, I can see him. I can see Johnny. I've always been able to see Johnny. And I'm like, well, yeah. I mean, he's right here. And Grandpa's like, no, you don't understand. He says, you and I can see him. He says, your mommy and daddy, they can't see him. They just pretend to see him so they don't hurt your feelings. And I'm like, what do you mean? I said, how come they can't see him? He's not invisible. And Grandpa says, no, sweetie, he is invisible to everybody but us. He says, you're like me. I go, what do you mean I'm like you? He says, you can see spirits. And I'm like, spirits? And he says, yeah. He says, Johnny is a little boy spirit. He's passed on. He's gone to heaven and he's back and he's kind of keeping you company here. And I'm like, I'm 6 years old at the time, and when you're that little, you don't have a concept of death. You don't have a concept really of what heaven's like other than what you're taught, and even at that young age, are you grasping much of what you're taught, about religion or spirituality? No. And I was just like, I don't get it. And Grandpa says, it's okay. I just want you to know I can see him. And he's a sweet little boy, and there's nothing wrong with you playing with him. He says, but I have to let you know, he says, when you're about 7 years old, Johnny's going to have to move on. I said, what do you mean? He says he's going to go on, and he's going to be someone else's little friend, because you're going to have more friends by then. And you'll start to go to their houses. They'll start to come over here. And Johnny knows you're not going to have time for him. And I'm like, no, I'll always have time for Johnny. He says, it's just the way of things. It's kids, they start to get older, they grow up, and these type of spirits, they know that. And he'll go on, he'll find another child who's feeling a little bit lonely, and he will come and, help them to feel better, to feel, like they have the attention of another child on a regular basis. And I really wasn't grasping what he was trying to tell me, but he was trying to prepare me for the time that Johnny would leave my side, which did happen about a year later. I was 7 years old, and Johnny came in my room that morning, and he says, look, he says, I'm going to have to go. And I said, well, where are you going? And he says, well, I have to go and help another little kid now. Another child needs me. And then he quickly said, but you've got, friends now. And I actually had one of my friends who was coming over to the house that very day. And I was all excited about her coming over. And he says, so you're going to do just fine. He says, and you won't miss me at all. And I said, what do you mean? And he reached over and he placed his index finger on my left temple. And he says, you'll remember me, but you won't miss me. And he smiled, and with that, he disappeared. That's the only time I ever saw Johnny do something supernatural. Because otherwise, he looked solid, just like you and I. He didn't look any different to me than my parents and my grandpa and my friends at school. But when he did that, when he touched my temple, and then he disappeared, it hit me. I was like, this was a spirit. And now he's gone. And then I was just like, I kind of started to get a little worked up, like I was going to start to cry, and all of a sudden I felt this sense of calm, this sense of peace. And I was just like, no, that's just how it's meant to be. And I was okay with it. And I went through the rest of my childhood. I always will have fond memories of Johnny. But just like he said, I was getting a little older now. I was starting to have friends come over. I was starting to go over to their houses and birthday parties and all that kind of stuff, So I didn't really miss him all that much. So it was just, a part of my growing up. Now, fast forward. It is now, let's see, I had my daughter when I was 35. And she started school late, because here in the States, particularly in Texas, you've got to be 5 years old by the start of the school year. And her birthday was September the 14th, so she had to wait till the following year, till she was just about to turn 6, before she could start kindergarten. So she went to kindergarten late, but I had her in Mother's Day out so she could get, socialized with other little kids and stuff, and that meant like twice a week. Well, starting when she was about 4, and that's when I started her on Mother's Day out, I would, hear her in her room, and she'd be talking and talking and laughing and talking and laughing. Then I realized it sounded like a one-sided conversation. She would say things and then kind of pause, like she's hearing a response. And I was just like, what? And then it made me think of Johnny, and I was just like, oh, I bet she has a little friend. And then I started thinking, I wonder if it's a spirit. So I go in her room and I kind of try to see with my mind's eye, and I cannot see spirits. It's not one of my spiritual gifts. I've only seen 2 in my whole life. So, I couldn't see if there was a spirit in there. But she started talking about George. And I would be like, who's George? And she'd say, he's my friend. Don't you see him? He's right here, Mommy. And I'm like, oh, hi, George. I did the same thing my parents did to me. You pretend you see the imaginary friend so you're not hurting the feelings of your child or making them feel like they're weird or something, And so she started doing the same thing that I did. She'd have her little meals and she'd be like, oh, Georgie needs to eat too, Mom. Please give George or Georgie a plate. And so I'd have to fix him a little bit of food, and they'd sit there together and she would chatter with him. And then she'd be like, yeah, George likes you, Mom. Georgie likes you. And I'm like, well, that's really nice. Thank Georgie for me. And she goes, he knows he can hear you. So time goes on, and so she's got this little friend named Georgie, and just like with me growing up, and it brought back so many memories of Johnny, because I could see the same patterns, and she'd be there in her room having a tea party with her little stuffed animals and dolls, and have an empty chair there, and that's where George sat. So then she starts kindergarten. Now remember, by now she's 6. She turned 6, 2 weeks into kindergarten. She turned 6. And I started wondering if this imaginary friend is really a spirit. Does that mean by the time she's 7, he's going to leave? Like Johnny left? And I was wondering, should I start preparing her now? Should I say something? And it was now like the middle of the school year. So it was like around January, February. And, she was one of the popular kids in school. Other kids just always have gravitated toward her entire academic career. She's had a lot of friends. And so they started coming over and playing, and I was like, yeah, he's gonna take off any day now. I need to start preparing her. Well, the teacher kind of in a weird way beat me to it. They had, it was like I said, it was around January, February. And in February, we have a holiday here in America called President's Day. And that's when we honor our founding father, our first president, George Washington, and also Abraham Lincoln. And their birthdays are like just a few days apart. And so they merged them into one holiday. And now basically it's for all the presidents, not just Washington and Lincoln. But originally, they had their own birthdays celebrated in February. Anyway, it was getting to be that time, and the kindergarten teacher decided to do a unit on George Washington, and then she was going to do a unit on Abraham Lincoln. So she has the overhead projector, and she puts a picture of George Washington up on the wall, and she says, my daughter just stood up and pointed at him and went, there's George, there's Georgie. And the teacher was really impressed that this, kindergartner knew who George Washington was. I was going to say George Harrison. Anyway, George Washington. And she says, she asked my daughter, you know who he is? And she's like, yeah, that's Georgie. That's my Georgie. And she kind of looks at Ariel, and Ariel looks at her. And then evidently she tells the class that this is the first president of the United States. The president is the leader. She's explaining it to 5 and 6-year-old on their level. And then she gets to the part where George Washington died on such and such a date, which was a really long time ago. And that's when my daughter freaked out and said, Georgie is not dead. And the teacher's like, I'm sorry, honey, but he's gone. He lived a long time ago. And my daughter starts crying. She starts screaming and saying she's got to go home. She's got to go check on Georgie and make sure Georgie's okay. I got called to the school. And so my daughter was already in the nurse's office. And so when I got there, they made a call to the teacher, and she came down. She left her teacher's aide in charge of the class, and she came down to the nurse's office and explained to me exactly what happened. And then I went, oh, then it dawned on me. Could Georgie actually be George Washington? And I was just like, no, And I was just like, okay, I'll take her home and I'll get her calmed down and we'll talk about this and and she goes, yeah, and please email me and let me know what happens. And so I'm prepared for tomorrow. I'm like, okay, fine. So I took my daughter home, and as soon as she got home, she ran. We lived in an apartment at the time, and she runs up the stairs, and she's at the door. She's, hurry up, mommy, I gotta be sure Georgie's okay, and Georgie's inside. And I'm like, okay. So I open the door, let her in, and she goes running into her room, and I hear her exclaim, Georgie, there you are. I knew you were okay. And then she was like, at school, they told me you were dead. And then she pauses. There's this really long pause. And then my daughter's like, what? And then another long pause. And I'm there in the living room going, oh my God. What is going on here? And I kept telling myself, it couldn't possibly be George Washington. No. I mean, why would he come to my kid, And she's like, and then I hear her going, Mommy! And I go in there, I go, yeah. She goes, Georgie told me he's really dead. And I went, oh? And then she says, and he was the president. And I'm like, he was? And, I'm trying to keep it together here. I'm used to, by this time I've had numerous, weird experiences, but nothing that involved my daughter at that point. This was our first weird experience together. We've had others since. But, yeah, and she was like, I didn't know he's dead. How come you didn't tell me he's dead? And I'm like, well, I told her, honey, first of all, I didn't know who he was. Secondly, I can't see him. I said, if I were able to see him, I may have been able to tell you. And she's like, how come I can see him? And I'm like, well, because you're like me and you're like my grandpa. He and I can see spirits. And I guess you can see him too. I don't know. So she seemed to be pretty much okay with it. I mean, it was a shock that he was, deceased. Because I think just like with my Johnny, George would appear to her completely solid. Plus, from the way she described him at this point to me, he always appeared to her as he looks in the paintings, So in his most recognizable aspect, which is what a spirit will do. They will approach you in their most recognizable aspect. Some of them will approach you as they looked in the prime of life, So time went on, and I explained to her like a couple months later that as she got a little bit older, Georgie was gonna move on. And at this point I'd asked her, why do you think George is here with you? And she goes, oh, well, he keeps me company, but mainly he helps me to learn how to deal with people. And I'm like, what? You gotta remember, this is a 6-year-old child telling me this. I go, what do you mean he helps you learn how to deal with people? What people? And she just kind of shrugged her shoulders nonchalantly. She's like, I don't know, Mom, but he tells me how to get along with people, how to listen to people, how to get people to talk to me, and basically how to behave and how to make people comfortable around me, to feel nice around me. And I was like, thinking to myself, is he gearing her to be a politician? I didn't know. I had no idea. Well, as it turns out, he left her when she was 7, just like my Johnny had taken off when I was 7. And again, same kind of thing. She was just okay with it. One day she comes out of her room and she goes, well, George came and he said he had to go now. He had to go work with somebody else and teach them how to deal with people. And he said that I did really, really well. And he was very proud of me. I'm like, that's nice, sweetie. That was it. It's the last time she ever mentioned him. No crying, no feeling sorry. Nope, that was it. Now, as to what she does later in life, I still don't know. She's just now, she's about to turn 26 next month. She got married last October, and I don't know what she's going to do with her life. I don't know if she is going to end up being involved with a lot of people. I do know she has a very strong online presence now, and she has followers, and she does, videos for them and stuff too. So maybe that's what it's going to be. I don't know. I don't know. And I have not planted the thought in her head because I want to see, how she evolves over time. So if you have kids and they start playing with an imaginary playmate, they may not be as imaginary as you think. Thank you for watching today. If you enjoyed this video, I ask that you hit the like button, you subscribe to my channel, and please drop a comment because they help my channel to grow, and it's been doing so great, and I'm just so happy. It's beyond my expectations. So I originally did this just for myself and to have a permanent record of my family's experiences. So I never thought anybody else would really enjoy them. So I'm very honored that you do, very pleased, and I appreciate all the wonderful comments you are leaving. So thank you for watching. I post every Wednesday, 12 noon, Central Standard Time. I will see you again next week. And this is Nefer Kefri, your hostess with the ghostess, and you've been watching True Tales of the Paranormal.